All right, hi Year 11. So today I'm going to be going through with all of you some of the theory and the big concepts and ideas that we all need to understand before we can really get into this unit, narratives that shape our world. So I'm going to be delivering this in a kind of lecture style. So it'll be the PowerPoint with me speaking over the top of it. But like in a lecture, I want you to be taking notes. So get out something to take notes on, whether that's your computer or your writing. I want you to pause and rewind the video if there's anything that you don't understand. And most importantly, I want you to be writing down any questions that you have as we go, because in tomorrow's lesson, we will have a Zoom where I want you to ask any of those questions that you have as we go through this presentation, because some of the concepts are quite challenging or seem to be intuitive, but when you really start thinking about them, can be difficult to get your head around. So I want you to engage with this, think deeply, and write down any questions that you have as we go so that we can discuss them tomorrow. Okay, so underpinning this unit is the concept of narrative theory, or the framework of narrative theory. And so we need to understand what that is before we can understand this unit. So narrative theory is an academic study or an academic field that begins with the assumption that narrative is one of the key strategies that humans use to understand and navigate their experiences and the world around them. Okay, so it begins with this assumption that narrative is something that we as humans use and have always used to come to terms with elements of our experience. So things like our understanding of time, our understanding of change, the quest for meaning. Okay, how do we navigate our own experiences of that? Well, narrative theory would suggest that one of those ways is through stories and through narrative. And it's from this assumption that narrative is one of those strategies that narrative theory studies the distinctive elements of narrative. So some of the big questions that narrative theory asks are things like, why is narrative so pervasive in all human culture? Why do we continue to tell stories? What makes narrative powerful? Why do we continue to be driven to tell each other stories, read narratives, watch films? Why is narrative powerful? What are the essential or basic elements of narrative? So what makes something a narrative? And then the interesting one, and the one that we're going to be grappling with quite a bit during this unit, is, do narratives reflect or shape the world in which we live? Okay, so is narrative something that simply reflects the world in which it is created, or does narrative have the power to shape the world in which it's created? And if so, how does that process actually work? How does narrative interact with the real world? So in this conceptualization of narrative, a story is not just a story, and a book is not just a book. There is a very real and important connection between the stories that we tell at a particular point in time in history and in culture, in a particular culture, and the real world that we live in. There's a connection between the stories we tell and the world that we live in. What that connection is what narrative theory seeks to understand. That connection is worth further investigation. So I guess this is a great answer to any of you who have ever asked that lovely question of, why should you study English, or why is English important? Narrative theory offers one answer. Okay, narrative theory says that books are not just books. Stories are not stories. They don't exist in a vacuum. They exist in connection to, in a process of reflecting and shaping and impacting, critiquing parts of the real world. And so that means that we should pay attention to them because they're powerful and they have the ability to do something. They're not inactive. Okay, so one of the key concepts that we need to understand is the idea of a meta-narrative. So this term meta-narrative was brought into prominence by a French philosopher. His name was Jean-Francois Lyotard, if that's how you pronounce it. And he used the term meta-narrative in his 1979 book, The Postmodern Condition, a report on knowledge. So it was first used by Lyotard as a postmodern and skeptical thinker. So for Lyotard, a meta-narrative is a narrative that gives context, meaning, and purpose to all of life. It's a story that purports to have the power to explain all of life and unite all other stories. So another term that's used instead of meta-narrative is grand narrative. So this is a narrative or a story that is an overarching story that says it can explain all of history, give meaning to all of life, unite all other stories underneath it. So you could think of it as being similar to a worldview. So for Lyotard, theories like Marxism or Freudianism, or even the scientific worldview, religions like Christianity or Buddhism, or any religion, would be considered by him to be a meta-narrative, in that these are stories that are grand narratives. They say that they can explain all of history. And by stories, he means that, well, they have characters, they have a plot that's developing and leading towards some kind of climax and resolution. They have events that are causally linked, like a story. And Lyotard says that they're one of the ways that humans have sought to make sense of the world. So this is Lyotard here, if you want to see what he looked like. But he was a postmodernist and he had a problem with meta-narratives. In fact, he said that postmodernism was defined by a mistrust and an objection to the concept of meta-narratives, the idea of meta-narratives. He did not accept that there was any overarching story that gave purpose and meaning to life. And instead, he said that within postmodernist thought, there should be a focus upon the narrative of the individual. So there is no grand narrative that's giving meaning to all of life. Instead, there are only small individual narratives that give meaning to individual lives. So he, there's this constant idea that narrative is used to give meaning. It's just what that narrative is and how that works that is in contention and is being discussed within this kind of theoretical discussion. So he, if a meta-narrative speaks of an absolute universal truth, then an individual narrative speaks of what is true for me, what gives meaning to my life. So postmodern thinking, we know, rejects meta-narratives because it rejects universal truth. In fact, postmodernist thinking views a single narrative giving meaning to all lives as an impossibility. Instead of focusing on a grand narrative, in postmodernist thinking, you focus on individual narratives, and especially narratives, you don't even not focus on the meta-narrative, you deconstruct the meta-narrative as being a story of those who have been in power Why was that story told? Who did it serve? What stories were not told because that story was being told? And then you start unpacking all of that. So I want to just pause for a moment there, and I just want you to remember and to remind you that this is all theoretical. So these are theories that we can engage with, we can challenge, we can agree with, we can critique, and that's something that I want you to do, to think about what's being suggested, how do you respond to that? One of the major critiques of Lyotard's version of narrative theory is that in the modern world, these meta-narratives, as he would call them, continue to have power and importance. And so maybe then his definition of a meta-narrative or his conceptualization of a meta-narrative as being something that you can mistrust and object to doesn't hold up. So just something to think about, and just remembering that when we're discussing all of this, we're discussing literary theory. So they're things that are things that we can engage with and critique as we go. Okay, so another important concept that's connected but slightly different is the idea of a master plot. Okay. And I know that this is a large quote of text, but I'm going to read it out to you because I think it really explains what a master plot is really clearly. So I'm going to read it to you. It's from the Cambridge Introduction to Narrative. So it says, master plots. These are the stories we tell over and over in myriad forms and that connect vitally with our deepest wishes, values, and fears. They are skeletal and adaptable, and they can recur in narrative after narrative. The rags to riches Cinderella story is one of them. Its variants can be found frequently in European and American cultures. Its constitute events elaborate a thread of neglect, injustice, rebirth, and reward that resounds to deeply held anxieties and desires. As such, the Cinderella master plot has an enormous emotional capital that can be drawn on when constructing a narrative. To the extent that our values and identity are linked to a master plot, that master plot can have a strong rhetorical or persuasive impact. We tend to give credibility to narratives that are structured by it, so structured by the master plot. There are some master plots that would appear to be universal. The Quest, story of revenge, seasonal myths of death and regeneration. But the more culturally specific the master plot, the greater its practical force in everyday life. All national cultures have their master plots, some of which are local variations on universal master plots. So you might have heard of things like this before, the idea that there are only 7 basic stories that just get retold over and over again. And that's what a master plot is. So things like the hero's journey, star-crossed lovers, the romance plot, these kinds of stories that have common elements that seem to just be recycled over and over again. And one thing that narrative theory asks is, why do we keep telling the same stories? What is it about them that is so important to us? What is their emotional capital, as Abbott puts it? And one of the answers is that they respond to some desire or anxiety that we have. And that's why we keep retelling them over and over again. But that last bit of the Abbott quote. The more culturally specific the master plot, the greater its practical force in everyday life. So there would be the idea that maybe there are 7 basic stories, but then another way that you can think of master plots is that there are also, cultural master plots. So there are master plots, stories that keep being retold over and over again, maybe in Australian culture. So the idea of the underdog might be an Australian master plot that's used, by politicians, that's used in the stories that we tell, that for some reason deeply resounds with Australians. Okay, so that's the idea of master plots. So one of the ones that I just mentioned there would be the quest master plot. I'm sure we're all familiar with it. But here's like a little blurb. So the protagonist is introduced and quickly encounters a motivating incident that spurs a quest for some grand thing. Along their journey, they meet a variety of characters, usually at least one that's helpful, like a mentor, and stays on for the journey. As the adventure develops, so does the main character. By the end of the quest, which is either successfully concluded or deemed pointless, the character is quite different than they were at the beginning. They discover that the true value of the quest was the lessons they obtained along the way, not necessarily the thing they originally sought, the end. And I'm sure that, you could rattle off the top of your head 10 books or films that would adhere to the quest master plot. Okay, they're easy to do. But you could write a similar blurb like this about any of the master plots, the Cinderella master plot, star-crossed lovers, the romance plot. They have similar elements that are repeated over and over again. And just remembering that narrative theory seeks to ask why. Why do narratives recur? And it's important to remember that a master plot is a storytelling technique, not the story itself. So many stories trade off the idea of the hero's journey, but the content of the stories will be very different. And different, the hero's journey constructed in different cultures, different points in time in history will be very different. So the master plot has key elements, but those key elements are flexible and they're recreated and reimagined over and over again. And the reasons for these variations in the master plot, as it's shown in different actual narratives, so actual books, actual TV shows, actual films, the reasons for the variations, but also the recurrences of a particular master plot in particular points in history or particular cultures is very interesting and part of what we'll be studying in this unit. Okay, so we're going to be looking at the Dark Knight, and we know that superhero stories are just so pervasive in our culture. One of the things we can ask is why. So why is it that there's such an obsession with the superhero narrative right now, and there has been, for a little while? Why is it chosen to recur now? Why is a quest story told now different to a quest story that was told 100 years ago? Okay, and obviously we know that the answer is going to be because of the context it was created in. And so by looking at the differences in stories that use the same master plot can give us insights into the context of construction and the way that that particular narrative, that particular story was interacting with the context and the world in which it was created. Okay, so that's the end of the presentation for today. So just making sure that you have written down any questions that you have, anything that didn't make sense. So tomorrow in the lesson, myself or Mr. Comerford can answer your questions. That would be really great. There will be a little activity for you to complete for the rest of this lesson about Masterplots. So just that's on OneNote for you. All right, thanks for your attention, Year 11, and we'll talk to you tomorrow.